All right, people, I think we will get going with this week's lesson in a minute. Okay, this week we're in the 8th century, roughly, 700 to 800. No, he's all right, he can hang out. I'll just come a bit forward. Let me pray and then we'll get going. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, we just pray that you would be with us this morning, Lord. We just pray that you would be glorified as we look at what you've done through your people in history, Lord, and that we would glorify you more as a result. In Jesus' name, amen. Right, so yes, we are looking at the 700s this week. We're powering through the centuries. And in the 700s, one thing that happens in the East and the West is that the rise of Islam is halted. 717 in Constantinople, and then also at 732 in what is the Frankish kingdom, Islam, which has been spreading over the past 100 years, is kind of halted in a couple of important battles. So we missed talking, or we just didn't talk about the rise of Islam last week. I just mentioned it in passing. So what we're going to do this week is go back into the 600s and just quickly and briefly chart the rise of Islam up until when it is halted in its advances in the 700s, if that makes sense. And then we'll just look at one of the main responses to the rise of Islam in the Eastern Empire, which is Iconoclasm. And then if there's time, we'll make a few brief remarks about what's going on in the West, in the Frankish kingdoms, and in Britain as well, if there's time. But if the last few weeks are anything to go by, there won't be time. So let's just jump straight into the rise of Islam. Right, everyone knows it begins with a chap called Muhammad, who's born roughly 570-ish in Mecca, which is in Arabia. And it's a place where there's a lot of ideologies swirling around, a lot of religious information that people can pick up. No one dominant religion in that area. You've got Judaism. Orthodox Christianity is down there too. You've got Zoroastrianism, but then also the heretical sects of Christianity, Nestorianism that we talked about briefly a couple of weeks ago, and Monophysitism as well. And then just, if that wasn't enough, you've got to throw into the mix, there's also Gnostic ideas still kicking around in Arabia. It's kind of been dealt with in what was the old Roman Empire, but it's still hanging on, clinging on in those peripheral states around the empire, such as the states in southern Arabia, Manichaeanism as well. And then there's just straight up pagans, the old pagan religions and pantheist religions that were around before Christianity and during the early centuries of Christianity. They're still kicking around. There's some remnants of that in southern Arabia as well. So out of that crazy mix, out of that diverse mix of ideas, Muhammad basically kind of picks and chooses some of the myths, some of the legends, some of the ideas, and mashes them together to form something that becomes Islam later on over a century or two of development. But anyway, the traditional story is that in 613 or so, when he's about 40 years old, he has these revelations from God. No one is exactly sure what happened there or what he actually is said to have received from God, because it's not actually for another 70 or so years that anyone ever writes down what he said. So the historian is kind of left puzzling over, guessing. If you want to find the historical Muhammad, it's very hard to find what he actually said. But whatever he did say was very charismatic, had an impact on the local tribes in Arabia, and it basically emphasized the unity of God. We can get that much. There is one God against what was prevailing in the culture around, that there was many gods. There's one God, and he brings a certain unity to the warring tribes of the area. So you have many tribes in southern Arabia all fighting each other. He gives them a chance to come together and put that energy of war into fighting someone else, which is a great message. So he has this message of community, which he calls Ummah, and jihad, which we all know now, is war. And that message resonates with the tribes of southern Arabia. In 622, he goes to Medina, which is the second most holy city of Islam these days, and that's called the Hijra. He moves to Medina, and it's from there that he builds up his power base, converts these tribes to this new idea of God and the Ummah, the community. And 629, he marches from Medina down to Mecca in order to take Mecca, which is where he's from, where he's born, takes it with military force and destroys all of the shrines in Mecca other than one. And you know this shrine, it's the Kaaba, that black stone box that is in the holiest mosque of Islam that you pray towards Mecca, and you go there once in your lifetime. That's one of the 5 pillars of Islam, to walk around it and pray. And that's supposed to be where Isaac and Abraham, that's supposed to be Ishmael and Abraham put that shrine up. What it actually was a pagan shrine that may well have been a meteor rock. Some people think that existed, but he chose to save that one, destroys all the other shrines in Mecca, and that kind of becomes his base of operations. But he dies. He dies in 632. By the time he does die, most of Arabia was Muslim. But that's a loose term, because, like I said, what did it mean to be Muslim at the time? Nothing's written down. It's kind of a very loose association of tribes at this point, with no real central doctrine other than there's one God and we must fight those that do not agree with us. That's basically as deep as it gets at that point. He is succeeded by a chap called Abu Bakr, who's Muhammad's father-in-law, and his successors, the first 4 successors after Muhammad, are known as the Rashidun Caliphate. The first 4 successors starting with Abu Bakr, and it's during his his rule as the Caliphate, that Islam comes into contact with the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and Christianity. And basically, they do very well in their battles against the Byzantine Empire. Why do they do so well? Why does Islam rise so fast and the Arabs have such impressive victories against the empire? Well, historians have debated this for many years. So the kind of dominant ideas are that, yes, they had a very fanatical ideology that gave them a real reason to fight this new religion that gave them a purpose in life. All of a sudden, it's possible that was important in their victories. Also, the promise of looting and booty. That's also a motivating factor. They're taking more territory, because the soldiers have to be paid, so that it just keeps expanding as ever more conquest is needed to pay the army. So that's another factor that could be important. Also, people debate the tactics. We don't want to get too much into that, get into the weeds there, but they certainly were rapid movers. They went into an area, the Arabs, and decimated the villages around a major town or a major city, killed everyone, and then laid siege to a city. And that is going to mean that the city is going to surrender under peaceful terms much quicker than if you just go straight to the city, besiege it, because they've seen the land around be absolutely decimated. So it makes much more sense for them to be like, okay, if you don't kill us, then we'll surrender to you. So that's one tactic that I think was quite effective. But basically, most historians these days think that the real reason why Islam did so well against the Byzantine Empire is this. The Byzantines and the Persian Empire, the Sassanid Empire, had been fighting each other for the past 50 years or so, and on and off for a lot longer than that. And basically, the two empires were exhausted. Byzantine Empire had spent all its money, a lot of its troops, in a war against the Persian Empire, and they'd come to a bit of a stalemate. Neither side had really won outright, and both empires were exhausted at the point. And it's in that context that along comes this fresh new army with its ideology, with its energy, with its young men, and they just take advantage of the situation. And the Byzantine Empire is in no state to really put up a good defense against the Arab invasions. Be that as it may, it's in 634 that the Arabs do invade Syria, and they have their first battle against the Byzantines called the Battle of Ajnanadin, and the Byzantines lose that pretty badly, and Damascus falls, which is the capital of Syria, the Syrian region of the Byzantine Empire. And then there's a larger battle, a 6-day battle of Yarmouk in 636, where the Byzantines are absolutely routed. It's a huge battle, 6 days long, and that kind of spells the end of Byzantine rule in Syria. And it's following that battle, 636-37. There's a year-long siege of Jerusalem, and that surrenders in 637. It surrenders on the condition that the terms be delivered by the Caliph himself. Sophrinus of Jerusalem, who's the Bishop of Jerusalem, won't surrender to anyone. He insists that it's the Caliph. So the Caliph comes to Jerusalem in 637 in a very symbolic moment. He goes to the dome, or not the Dome of the Rock yet. He goes to where the temple used to be, the Temple Mount. And Sophrinus of Jerusalem is heard to have muttered to himself, "Behold, the desolation that causes destruction is standing in the holy place." That quote that Jesus has when he's talking about the Olivet Discourse there. Sophrinus says that. But the Caliph comes to see the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and Sophrinus offers the chance for the Caliph to pray in that church. So kind of an interesting moment there. But the Caliph refuses because he says, if I pray in this church, then my followers are just going to take it down. They're just going to burn it down and build a mosque instead, or a shrine or something to my memory instead. So he doesn't pray in the Holy Sepulchre, and that's kind of a myth. Well, I don't know if it's a myth. It's a possibly apocryphal story about why the Church of the Holy Sepulchre survived in Jerusalem. Anyway, so that's Jerusalem falls 637. Also in 637, Antioch falls, another major city in the empire, and then 639. Egypt falls as well. So whole regions are just capitulating to the Arabs. Then there's a little bit of a break because the Arabs have a bit of infighting. They have a civil war. It's called the Fitna. It's the first civil war. And this is when the Caliph Uthman was assassinated, and in his place Ali ibn Abi Talib. Let me say that again. Ali ibn Abi Talib takes over, and he becomes the fourth caliph. And this is where, if this is a little fun fact for you, this is where the division between Sunni and Shia Islam comes, Muslims come. You've heard those two terms. Well, this is where it comes from. Shia Muslims believe that Ali should have been the first caliph. He should have taken over from Muhammad. And Ali is Muhammad's son-in-law. So if you're a Sunni Muslim, you believe that he was the rightful heir of Muhammad. Shia Muslims believe that it was actually Abu Bakr, Muhammad's father-in-law, that should have taken over. So that's where that divide comes from. When you've heard people say Shia Muslim, Sunni Muslim, that's what that's all about originally. Since then, a lot more has been added to it, but that's kind of where the original division comes. So there's a little civil war in 656, 661, which gives the empire a chance to rest and relax a little bit, or build up some defenses, at least, whilst the Arabs fight themselves. But when the civil war settles down, the conquests continue under a new caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphate. That's the next kind of dynasty that takes over after the civil war, the Umayyad Caliphate. And they move their capital to Damascus, so that Damascus is now the capital of the Arab world and the caliphate. And it's in 709 that they finally take all of North Africa, and they begin to send over raiders into southern Spain, Gibraltar. And in 711, basically all of Spain has been taken by the Arabs. The Visigoths, who were there in their kingdom, capitulate fairly quickly in 711. So by the early 700s, the entire Eastern Empire outside of what is now Turkey has been taken, all of North Africa and all of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, in the early 700s. So the situation does not look good. And this is where there is a slight turning point. And that is in 717, the Arabs finally get all the way to Constantinople. So they go all the way through Anatolia, through modern-day Turkey, all the way up to Constantinople, 717. They lay siege to the city, but they are repelled. And this is like one of those great moments in history. They are repelled by the use of this great new technology that the Greeks have discovered, and historians know it as Greek fire. And no one knows exactly what it was, but it's obviously some sort of petroleum that they're able to set alight and catapult out into the water, because it stays on water alight and sets fire to all of the Arab ships. So with this great weapon, the Greeks are able to turn the tide, and the Arabs retreat from Constantinople, and it kind of leaves that area in a stalemate. So the Eastern Empire is the line is drawn where Islam is able to get up to, which is basically the edge of modern-day Turkey in the east. In the west, like I said, the Arabs are taken all of the Iberian Peninsula, so that's Spain, the southern border of France and Spain these days is where they're up to. And in 732, there's a very big battle, the Battle of Tours, or Tours, if you're French, and it's been seen as a great turning point in history, where Charles Martel, King of the Franks, defeats the invading Arab hordes, and it saves Europe from Islamic conquest. That idea has been challenged more recently by historians, because no one really knows exactly what happened in this battle. It's become a great moment that people see as a turning point, but really it's only mentioned in a couple of chronicles, and all we really know about it is that Charles Martel was the king of the Franks, and that the Franks win. We don't know the numbers involved. We don't know exactly why now, after 711, they took Spain, why 732 was when they advanced into Frankish kingdom. So there's not a lot of information about this battle, but what we do know is that after this battle, 732, there is no more invasions. So the Arabs do kind of just settle down in Spain, and the Frankish kingdom is kind of left alone. So by this time, 730s, that's it. The lines are drawn, and for the next 1,000 years or so, up until the Crusades, this is, next 500 years or so, up until the Crusades, that's how the situation stands. Christianity and Islam kind of hold the same borders for the next few centuries. So that leaves the question, what happened to the Christians in the areas that were taken by the Arabs? Well, as you can imagine, that it causes a lot of self-reflection on the part of the Christians, soul-searching. What on earth happened, they say to themselves. And you get at this time a lot of references, surprise, surprise, to Daniel and Revelation and Jesus' discourse, the Olivet Discourse, all those apocalyptic parts of the Bible people start quoting, thinking that perhaps the prophecies of Daniel relate to the final empire, the Arab Empire coming and taking it over what used to be the Roman Empire. Lots of people asking God, what on earth is going on? These guys are heathens. These guys are clearly idolaters, blasphemers. They don't believe in Jesus, the Son of God. What is God teaching us? This must be a punishment. It's kind of the dominant question idea that people have. And it's during this time that we see, the early 700s now, that we see Islam beginning to take the shape of what we would recognize as Islam. Like I said, it's only in this period that the Quran begins to be written down. So it's only now that we get some doctrine behind what people have been doing. And also the Hadith, which is the sayings of Muhammad. That's kind of like the second most important book in Islam is the Hadith. These things that Muhammad is supposed to have said, those get kind of written down and codified in the early 700s as well. And mosques start to be built as well. Up until this point, Muslims have been using Christian churches to pray in. And that's not because they were super tolerant and we all worshipped the same God once upon a time. It's just because where's the only building that's big enough to house a congregation of people who want to pray? The church. So they use the church for now. But in the early 700s, Islam begins to build mosques and takes a lot of their architectural techniques and decorations from Byzantine art. So it's kind of funny that a lot of things we think of as being very Muslim now is actually Christian Byzantine in its origin. Even the crescent moon is the symbol of Islam. The crescent moon is actually originally a Byzantine Christian symbol. So it's kind of ironic in a way. And a lot of this takes place under a chap called Abdul Malik. 685-707 is when he was caliph, and he's a great reformer in Islam. He builds the Dome of the Rock, and he puts on the Dome of the Rock specifically anti-Christian quotes, and just to lay to the myth that Christians and Muslims in these early days got along really well and basically believed the same thing. Here's a key quote from the Quran that kind of deals with Islam's relationship to Christianity, that was, like I said, written down, codified sometime in these early 700s. This is from Ayah 4, which is chapter 4, Surah 171, chapter, verse, Ayah, Surah. And it says this: O people of the book, meaning Christians, do not exaggerate in your religion, and do not say about God anything but the truth. The Messiah, Jesus, Mary's son, is only God's messenger, and his word he imparted to Mary, and a spirit from him. Believe in God and in his messengers, and do not say three. Stop it. It is better for you. God is but a single God. He is too exalted for anything to become a son to him. Anything in the heavens or anything on the earth, God suffices as a guardian. So there we have it. When people say, back in the day, once upon a time, there was a golden age when Christians and Muslims, they got along. They even knew that they worshipped the same God. No, it's not true, because the crucial fact is that in Islam, there is no place for Jesus as the Son of God. That's crucial. And there's no place for the Trinity. And if Christianity is anything, it's a Trinitarian religion that worships Jesus as the Son of God. So there's two very different views of God right from the beginning. But it is true that originally Christians were able to have some sort of status under Muslim occupation. You see a few prominent examples of Christians being high-ranking civil servants under Islam. The most famous being John of Damascus, who we'll see in a second is important in the debate about Iconoclasm. He's a high-ranking civil servant, but is able to be a Christian. But over time, that becomes harder and harder. And in these early decades, it is true that Islam would, or Arabs would come into an area and take it over, and people would be able to continue to some extent with their lives as it was before their invasion. But the situation changes for several reasons. One is, after the invasion, the soldiers that were living in cities or encampments of their own building, separate from the local populations, after the invasions had moved on and there was no more advancing and everything kind of settles down, those soldiers begin to, as you would imagine, settle in the towns, in the cities, in the villages, and intermarry, and there's much more mixing of the cultures that basically erodes a lot of the Christianity that existed prior to the Arab invasions. Also, there's the whole issue of the jizya, which is the tax that is imposed upon Christians. And here's the quote about that from the Quran, Ayah 9, Surah 29. It says that followers of the Prophet are to fight the people of the book till they pay the poll tax out of hand and submissively. So it's not so much that Islam wanted to kill all Christians. They just wanted to make sure that everyone knew that they were a second-class citizen if you're not a Muslim. So it's fine, you can go about being a Christian as long as you pay this tax and you do it submissively. That's the whole point. It's supposed to be embarrassing. It's supposed to prove that Christians are subservient to Muslims. And it's even said that Christians, when they paid their tax, had to hold out their hand flat with the coin on it and give it to the taxman so that their hand would never rise above the hand of a Muslim, because the hand of a Muslim was that much superior. It was supposed to be an act of total subservience to your overlord, in a way. And then some more reforms make it much harder to be a Christian in the 700s as well. In 715 to 720 was the Caliphate of Umar II, and he made it so that legally in the empire or the Caliphate, Christians who convert to Islam would be legally the same as someone who is an Arab and born a Muslim. So up until this point, if you converted to Islam, you were still kind of not quite legally as good as an actual Arab, but he makes it so that everyone's the same. So it gives a great incentive that if you're kind of like, I don't really like paying the jizya, what's the difference really? If you're kind of on the fence, as it were, between Christianity and Islam, it was a great incentive to become a Muslim because you get all the benefits of being legally within the empire of being a Muslim. And then the final thing is that the imposition of the language of Arabic basically killed off a lot of Christianity as well. It kind of diluted the differences between Christian culture and Arab culture to the extent that after a few centuries, or after a few decades rather, into the 700s, Greek was no longer really used in the Eastern Empire, and Arabic was the dominant culture, dominant language. So basically what you have is Christianity in those areas. This is what happened. In the initial wave of conquests, a lot of Christians died, obviously, in battle and conquest. Those that didn't die basically just drifted over in 50 or 60 years or so of living under Islamic rule. The vast majority just drift over to Islam slowly as it becomes more and more harder to, is that right English, to stay a Christian. And then you do have a remnant that survives, and so that's like the Coptic Church in Egypt. You still see some of the Nestorian Christians in Iran and Persia as well. So there is a small remnant that remains, but most slowly drift over in a sad way to the new dominant religion of Islam. So that is the rise of Islam in a very brief and superficial overview. Now let us look at one specific response to Islam and the rise of Islam that happened in the Christian empire of the Byzantine Empire, and that is iconoclasm. Now, iconoclasm, we use it in the English language. It means to be destructive. You're an iconoclast if you break things down. What it basically means is icon is image, clasm, destroying images. By the 700s, the Eastern Empire was chock full of icons. There was quite a highly sophisticated theology of icons had developed in the Eastern Empire. And obviously Islam, as it progressed, it was a religion with no images. It did not depict God. So there was kind of a simple response to that in the minds of some Christians in the East was, hey, perhaps this is a punishment on the fact that we keep on depicting God, and there's a second commandment that seems to imply that maybe we shouldn't do this. So there's a great debate in the Eastern Empire. Let me just quickly run through that debate and some of the ins and outs of it. Basically, as you all know, early Christianity, there was not really any art, so to speak of. Early Christian, the first 2 centuries or so, we don't really have any pictures of Jesus and not much Christian art. There's some symbols that we know of, the Cairo symbol. Obviously, everyone knows the fish, those sorts of things. There's some symbolic representations and things like that in the early centuries, but no actual pictures of Jesus. And then you start to get in the 3rd century, places like the catacombs in Rome, you start to get kind of pictures of Jesus, but not literal pictures of him kind of giving a sermon or being crucified, things like that, but kind of more symbolic, metaphorical pictures of Jesus. You get a lot of him being the good shepherd. There's lots of pictures of Jesus carrying sheep over his shoulders, things like that, in the catacombs in Rome. And you also get the appropriation of Roman art in the 300s and into the 400s. So the way that the emperor is depicted, Christians would just kind of copy that, and they start depicting Jesus as basically a Roman Empire, a super white dude with long flowing golden hair in a robe, much like the emperor would have worn, kind of presiding over his people like an emperor. So they kind of just take the Roman art, Christianize it a little bit in the early 400s, or early 300s rather, as Christianity becomes the official religion of the empire. It kind of made us a lot of sense at the time. But even in that process, while that is going on, some Christians don't like it. Eusebius of Caesarea says this. He says, Christians don't need any artificial image of Christ. For Christ's historical image, the form in which he underwent the humiliation on the cross has been superseded by his divine splendor, his humanity, and has been amalgamated with his divinity. This splendor cannot be depicted in lifeless colors. Rather, Christians must look forward to that moment when we meet him face to face in the glory of the age to come. So this kind of idea that you can't draw a picture of Jesus in his glorified body, his resurrection body, because you'll only ever capture his humanity and not his divinity. You can only draw the human nature, not the divine nature. That's kind of his point, Eusebius' point. And that was kind of one side of the argument in the 300s. But as the 300s progressed and Christianity becomes more and more the mainstream, and there's more and more buildings built specifically to be churches, those churches get decorated with Christian art, and Christian art flourishes to the point that in the 500s, Gregory the Great can say that pictures in churches are books for the illiterate. It's a very famous quote that Gregory says, basically, if you can read the Bible, and you'll find out about Jesus there. If you can't read, like the majority of people, they can look at the pictures on the wall and they can learn the Christian story that way, is kind of his idea. So he's kind of lending some credence to the idea that churches should be full of gospel narratives and lives of the saints and things like that. It's in the East that the theology develops a little bit more than that. It's not just for decoration. For them, the icons actually have a power in themselves, and you start to have a lot of stories in the 500s and into the 600s of icons performing miracles, because in the Eastern Empire and the Eastern Church, the idea was that when you drew an image of a saint, in some senses you brought some of the holiness of the saint down into the image, so that they could perform these miracles, and they could kind of bring the realm of the divine and heaven into the church. So that's why Eastern Orthodox churches are full of saints, is because you're supposed to be worshipping in heaven with the saints, and by representing these saints on the walls, you in some sense bring down the divine and the heaven into the very building that you're worshipping in. That's kind of the idea in the East in the 600s. And there's a council in 692 called the Ecumenical Council in the Eastern Empire, and it says this. It says to not depict Christ symbolically as a lamb, but as a human, so that we may perceive through it the depth of the humiliation of God, the Word, and be led to the remembrance of his life and flesh, his passion, his death, and the redemption which it brought to the world. So in the East, it actually becomes against church law to depict Christ symbolically. So you've probably all seen the Agnus Dei, which is when Jesus is depicted as a lamb in Catholic art. That's actually against church doctrine in the Eastern Empire. Has to be a person. Jesus can only be depicted in his human form in the Eastern Empire. So that's kind of the situation in Christian art in the 700s, when a chap called Leo III comes to the throne. And he comes to the throne of the empire as the emperor, Byzantine emperor, in 717, which, if you remember, was the year that Constantinople was laid siege to by the Arabs. And it's so he comes to the throne during that siege of Constantinople, and like I said, the Byzantines win that one. They win that one, and it's kind of ironic that they win. And in the kind of course of events in the siege, they parade an image of the Virgin Mary around the walls. So the soldiers are fighting the battle, but the clergymen, whilst that's going on, are parading this image of the Virgin Mary around the walls. So the victory is attributed to the Virgin Mary by the church at the time in 717. But that does not stop Leo III having a great distrust and dislike of images, because it's in 726 that he kind of begins this movement of iconoclasm, and he does so by taking down the image of Christ, which was over the bronze doors to the imperial palace. So the palace he lived in had a huge picture of Christ above the doors. He takes that down, and he orders his Patriarch of Constantinople, the Bishop of Constantinople, Germanus, to officially teach iconoclasm. And in 730, he has an edict prepared that outlaws images of Jesus in the empire. His Patriarch Germanus does not do that. He declines, so he's kicked out of his position and replaced with Anastasius, Patriarch of Constantinople, Anastasius, who does enact the edict, so it becomes against the law in the Eastern Empire to have any images of Jesus in your church. In 731, the Pope hears about this, does not like it. He holds a synod in Rome that excommunicates the Patriarch and the Emperor. So you now have another schism where the Eastern Empire Church and the Empire is out of communion with the Western Church. There's a schism following that synod in 731. In 740, Leo dies, the emperor dies, and his son Constantine V becomes emperor. And if anything, this guy likes icons even less than his dad. He ramps up the destruction of icons and the getting rid of images, and he insists that you can only have a picture of the cross or hunting scenes in your church. So only the cross or hunting scenes, or if you must, gardens full of birds and animals. So that's what you can decorate your church with. Not any pictures of any people or specifically Jesus. He issues another edict, and he gives some theology behind this edict, and this is kind of his thought process. He says the only proper image of Christ would be one that was the same essence as its prototype. But Christ has one prosopon, which means person, one person compounded inseparably of human and divine nature. If an image of Christ pictures only as human nature, it severs that nature from the divine nature and is a false image of Christ. Any attempt to picture both natures, human and divine, is attempting to reduce the divine to limits, to circumscribe the divine, something which is impossible. The conclusion is that Christ cannot be pictured. The only real image of Christ is the one which he himself gave us, the true image not made by hands, the Holy Eucharist. Yeah? So we would think as Reformed people, the reason not to have icons is because of the second commandment. Not so in the Eastern Empire. It doesn't really come up in the debate as much as you think it would. The reason is Jesus is because of all the debates they've been having about the two natures of Christ. Is that you can't separate the natures and just depict one nature. You have to depict both, and if you depict both, you're going to try and draw divinity. You can't draw divinity. That's a nonsense. The only image is the Eucharist. So for them, it's integrally intertwined with the idea of the sacraments. It's a sacramental argument that he puts forward. So there's a different way of thinking there from what we would imagine. Anyway, he has a council. The council meets in 754, and there's 338 bishops there, large council in 754, and they meet and they outlaw, or they kind of give the symbol of the stamp of approval to the outlaw of images. And they add another layer to the argument. They say that Christianity has rejected the whole of heathenism. So not merely heathen sacrifices, but also heathen worship of images. The saints live on eternally with God, although they have died. If anyone thinks to call them back again to life by dead art discovered by the heathen, he makes himself guilty of blasphemy. Who dares attempt with heathenish art to paint the Mother of God, who is exalted above all heavens and all the saints? It is not permitted to Christians who have the hope of resurrection to imitate the customs of demon worshippers and to insult the saints who shine in so great glory by common dead matter. So there's another layer to the argument, in as much as basically that's what pagans do, is like try and bring in the divine by representing the divine in their temples. That's like if you went into a Roman temple or Greek temple, there would be an image of the god because that was supposed to bring, in some sense, the god's presence into that temple. Christians, we don't copy heathens in our worship. Is kind of the idea there. So that's the council in 754. No images for those reasons. But Constantine dies, as most people do. 775. He dies, and his son Leo IV takes over. He is tolerant of icons, not so bothered by the whole issue. He dies, and his son becomes Constantine VI, and he is only 10 years old, so he can't rule. So his mother, Irene, she kind of inserts herself as empress, and she loves icons. So basically, she has the power to call another council, 786, and this is the 7th Ecumenical Council. This is the council that is held in high regard in the Eastern Empire, and it's accepted by Roman Catholics as well. 786, the 7th Ecumenical Council, and they repeal the last council. They say, no, let's get rid of that one, and let's actually bring back the icons. So that's what happens, and the reasoning that they have is this. This is kind of their argument. If we made an image of the invisible God, we would certainly be in error, obviously, but we do nothing of the sort, for we are not in error if we make an image of the incarnate God, who appeared on earth in the flesh, and who, in his ineffable goodness, lived with human beings and assumed the nature, quantity, shape, and colour of flesh. So it's a very simple argument. If Jesus became a human, you can depict a human. We're not trying to draw God, the invisible God, God the Father. We're only trying to draw the incarnate God, the human, Jesus Christ. That's kind of the argument. And that argument wins the day, and icons are replaced in the church. Actually, as you get into the next century, the 800s, the argument continues as it always does, and that council is repealed. And then again in 814, the council is repealed in 814. In 843, there's a final restoration of the idols, and that is an event that's commemorated down to this day in a feast in the Orthodox Church called the Triumph of Orthodoxy. So, in a nutshell, that is the iconoclastic controversy. And I think since there's people wanting to come into the room, we can leave it there for now, unless anyone has any questions or comments.